All right, welcome to our weekly Sunday Scripture study. This is live on both Doctrine of Christ and Real Mormonism channels. We continue where we left off last week, looking at Nephites in Europe evidence. And thank you, everyone, for being patient with us as we work through our technical issues to get live. So we're really excited to continue where we left off. Last week, we spent the majority of the time looking at tribal connections, possible tribal connections with the names of Anglo-Saxon tribes in the northern part of Europe where the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles, and the Saxons were based at. We're going to do a little bit deeper dive today about the general history of the Anglo-Saxons as well as other pieces of evidence in addition to just those tribal names that seemed a little bit superficial, maybe easy to dismiss. There's a lot more that we want to pile onto that today. We did spend a significant amount of time last week also covering the significance or some of the pieces of significance scripturally, Doctrine and Covenants section 3, for example, of trying to trace where these Nephite tribes are, because as the Savior said to Joseph in section 3, separate from the Lamanites that exist today, there are Nephites, there are Josephites, there are Jacobites, there are Zoramites, and that was something that we wanted to point out. And so, okay, with that said, we're going to kind of back up just a little bit more, take a look at some of this, and see these Anglo-Saxon tribes. Maybe I can pull up another one of these maps again. But essentially, let's talk again, Josh. In general, the Anglo-Saxons, will you give us just an like the bird's eye view of who the Anglo-Saxons are, where they allegedly came from, what do we know about them, what don't we know about them? Because what we don't know about them is also an interesting piece.
Yeah, so the Anglo-Saxons, right, if we start at the end, in some sense, it can be called an Anglo-Saxon world that we're living in today, or in other words, the dominance, the cultural dominance of Anglo-Saxon peoples in modern times is massive, and that's tied to Western or European dominance, Western dominance, or Western civilization, and that power is centered in, probably most centered on the United States and its peoples, but of course the people of the United States are in question are predominantly European, and so the centers of power in Europe, in London, in Brussels, in Rome, and so forth. Anglo-Saxons. Well, this is where we need to start trying to break it down. Is Anglo-Saxon synonymous with Roman? Is it synonymous with German? What is it, right? And so in order to do that, what we need to understand is, well, what's the origin of the Anglo-Saxons? So the term itself comes from the Angles and the Saxons, which are two Germanic tribes.
Yeah, we see them right here.
Yeah, they originate from northern Germany or southern Denmark, right where you're pointing. And a migration occurs in and around 400 AD, I think a little bit before that too. And so, and then the modern term or name, so especially from an American point of view, when we think of England and we think of Britain, we over here in America tend to think of that as basically the same thing. England, Britain, same thing. It's not the same thing at all. And not being directly from Britain, I can't speak to how the average citizen over there is viewing it or understanding those terms or how they're being used. But the term Britain it's older and more original to that place. And the British, the English have become British, so to speak, because they moved to Britain, but they weren't originally British. So original British and English are not the same thing. So England is referring specifically to the Angles or the Angles and the Saxons together. They migrated into southeastern Britain, and that portion of the island became known as the land of the Angles or England. And the again, kind of it speaks to the dominance of the culture moving forward, that England and English has come to be synonymous with Britain in a
Right.
lot of the sense of the word,
Right.
because the English have played such a key role in a lot of things moving forward. Um, and so trying to appreciate, like Celts and Welsh are not English, and they
Right.
my understanding is if you call a good Welshman an Englishman, they can take offense at that, because that, it's like, I don't know, it'd just be like calling a, I guess I'm not sure. I was trying to think of an example, but it's just like I'm not an Englishman. I'm a Welshman.
Well, well, it would be like calling a Guatemalan a Mexican.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
They're like, I'm not a Mexican, I'm Guatemalan. Like, there's a huge difference.
Right,
And some people are like, well, you all look the same and sound the same. You speak the same language, blah blah blah. It's the same thing, or same with Asians. Calling a South Korean Chinese, or something.
right.
They're gonna. It's no different. They're gonna take offense. Like, that is not me. That's a totally different. There's a totally different set of people.
Yeah. And of particular note here is that the Angles and Saxons are distinctly a Germanic people. Um, I mean, 100%. Whereas the Celts and the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish, they aren't. They are not Germanic. Now,
Right. They had been here. They had been here a lot longer.
they had been here a lot longer. And so the Angles and the Saxons were newcomers on the island. But going back just a little bit further, the Germanic tribes themselves were newcomers to the
to
continent.
to this area.
Yeah, as far as the historical Roman perspective.
Now, are we saying all Germanic tribes, or are we saying these particular tribes?
Now we're saying all Germanic tribes. All Germanic tribes, if we go back further, we land at the era where they're referred to as the people of the Elbe or the Elbe River, or Elben people, which is our tie-in to the J.R.R. Tolkien's Elven race that he writes about, which is based on Germanic mythology. And so he was drawing on this historical cultural idea or narrative, or interesting. Not prepared with the reference. Mythology in older dictionaries was defined as true history obscured by age. Like, it's so old we just don't have a full picture anymore, but mythology it's just like ancient true history that's not fully known anymore.
Right.
There was actually a definition switch, I want to say it was like in the 20s or something, where they actually just changed it to like kind of a made up false history. It's not real. It's the stories of a people that don't come from anywhere. So anyway, so Tolkien was interested in preserving Germanic mythology in The Lord of the Rings. So he wasn't just, oh, this is cool, I could put this in my book. He wasn't just looking for material for his story, but he actually wanted to try to capture the understanding or essence of what the mythologies were trying to say or reveal. And because they were being lost, in his opinion, at that time, they were vanishing. And
Well, Anglo-Saxon in particular, right? Because eventually these Germanic tribes have lots of splits. We have the Goths. We have a lot of different tribes. The Lombards. that you briefly
Yeah.
mentioned last week. They ended up having a whole southern kingdom all of their own, and so Tolkien's focus was more on the Anglo-Saxon pieces that were
Well,
because they came to Great Britain more than anything.
yeah, and I can't speak to this exactly. This is my guess. The last Anglo-Saxon library to exist burned down in the 1920s, taking with it we have no idea. Like there were books, but somehow they had dwindled over a long period of time down to this one place where there was a collection, and then that burned down to the ground. And
In the 1920s.
yeah, how does the most culturally dominant people in the world lose all of their books? Not well, we have one left. We have Beowulf, and it's not the best one.
Right.
How does that happen? In the 20s, no, it's not like, well, they became dominant later after they lost all their books. We lost all our books well after having become the most
Hundreds of
influential.
years later, Britain had been dominant for hundreds of years.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, Britain had been, and England carried the crown, right? It was an English-led British Empire,
Right.
and the center or central people of this whole phenomenon, the Anglo-Saxon English people, have lost every single book of their history, and so there's only mythology left. And I believe what Tolkien was, I think he was interested in preserving his, sort of cultural identity,
Right.
understanding what that was. But in order to do that, you couldn't really appeal to some Anglo-Saxon identity or history or mythology because it had vanished. But you could easily enough say, well, we know where the Anglo-Saxons came from. They came from Germany. They're a Germanic people and tribe. All we really need to do is go a little further back into the Germanic mythologies, and that is going to be synonymous with the Anglo-Saxon mythology or ancient history.
Well,
Um,
it's also interesting to interject here. Interesting to note that he wrote The Lord of the Rings, etc. He started what 17 years. So if it burned down in 1920, he starts writing in the late 30s, Lord of the Rings. So he must have had. I mean, this he must have had some idea of some of this stuff already, and he was a very educated person, as we know, and a history professor. Is that right?
yeah, yep.
Sorry, a history professor. Switch those. A professor of history. So he it clearly wasn't lost on him despite being burned, and so there's almost like this idea of, hey, there needs to be some effort of preservation now that all that's gone.
Yeah, and I'm just looking his exact professor of English language and literature. Um, he was the chair of a college, and I want to say Oxford. It might not be.
Yeah.
This is easily able to be looked up. And anyway, it did apply to his professional career. He was interested in this. He was interested in language and linguistics, which obviously had a lot to do
Right.
with his
Yep.
own language and that of German, which by the way, English is a Germanic dialect. Um, Now it's a little more mixed up than most of the other German uh, versions of German that got out there, and that's because of the split when the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain, and then the various Roman incursions. A lot of Latin was taken in, and so, but the core or base English language is really fascinating. If you document or if you memorize the consonant and vowel shifts in English and in German, there's a set of rules. You can apply it to any English or any German, and you apply all the shifts, and you can basically, without knowing the other language, you can basically read the other language already
Right.
if you just understand the shifting that's taken place. So, and I mean, for me, this, I'm studying these ideas in more recent years. Uh, Traditionally, I didn't understand there was a connection between English and German. You know, you're born today, and kind of the biggest thing I think in our perception about who we are and who they are is World War II. The Germans are our enemies. We're the English, they're the German, and that's, you know, but we're both European. Not realizing that the English are German, and the word German is a Latin term that doesn't have anything to do um, with the Germans. Um, so so at any rate, our appreciating the strength of what a German tribe is, what German peoples are, that the English are, you know, full-blooded German, at least were at the time of the migration. Obviously, again, mixing will have taken place by degrees over time, depending on circumstance and geography, proximity, so forth. There's certainly mixing of Celtic people
Right. Yeah.
going on. And that's happening on the continent as well as on the island, because the Celtic peoples moved through Europe, same as the Germanic tribes did, only they did it generations earlier, if not well earlier, like 1,000 years or so, at
Right.
least earlier. Maybe it's more than that. Again, not prepared with exact dates on all this, but it's easily looked up. The Celtic migrations took place in an era prior to anything on the Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes are relative newcomers into the European scene, and this is documented by Roman historians like, I believe, Tacitus, writing about it, and Julius Caesar himself, encountering Germanic peoples and not actually being able to identify them as a known group of people. And if we're following the idea of a Nephite origin in the Germanic tribes, then the beginning for the Germanic peoples in Europe is 55 BC, or right near there, when Hagoth left the Americas, went somewhere, which puts us right at the time of Julius Caesar. And so they had not been there very long at the time that Caesar is turning, which is interesting. At this moment in time, 50 BC, the Roman Republic is transforming into the Roman Empire. And the Roman Republic is believed to have an origin in Hebrew peoples and had a republic, a government that was not tyrannical and that was based on the rule of law. Well, in 50 BC, that's all being lost. Julius Caesar's become a dictator, and he's becoming, he's trying, well, the empire is becoming, what's the right, like a conquest. They're taking over all of the adjacent lands, to just be a bigger, more powerful empire, right? That's what an empire is. It's more than a single country or nation, but it's where one country is expanded and taken over everything else, and it's all ruled by one center. Anyway, so at that moment, if there is a good version, well, there is. The Roman Republic was awesome. You've got really amazing things coming out of that heritage in terms of liberty and freedom. Excuse me, and that actually is also coming from the Greeks, and there was an awesome legacy there
Right.
for a time. And
Hey,
right at
Josh,
the tip of this,
while you're laying this out, by the way, let me interject
yeah.
real quick. While you're laying this out, I'll just pull up a map of the Roman Empire at its peak, about 100 AD, which is when it had reached its height.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a kind of just a little bit of a visual cue here. And so what's interesting about it that you'll notice right off the bat, not to I'll get right back to where you were at, but right upon first glance, so when they reach its peak, which is the height of what they'd conquered, you see all this area here. You see that they had gone through most of Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see here is exactly what you were outlining last time.
Yeah.
what is right here?
Well, okay. So that's actually the Elbe is further up, I believe.
Right here. I think this one's the Elbe, or is this one the Elbe? One of these two is the Elbe.
Yeah. And obviously, this is just a random map we pulled up. We might get a little bit different if we
Well,
keep,
this was 100. So if we took a snapshot 300 years later, it's going to look a little different.
yeah. But
But what's just
this is near
interesting,
the maximum expansion.
it's near the maximum expansion. Yeah, but you'll notice we talked about how they never conquered north of here. I think this one's the Elbe right there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Um,
that's the Elbe.
and so over the next several hundred years, they get to about here and don't go further. Interestingly enough,
Yeah, so that Germania Magna or Greater Germany,
right.
that's the group of people that they never conquered. Um,
At least not
they,
fully.
I, well,
I
I
mean, 'cause
mean, only a
they
little
clearly
bit,
take over
right?
some more of these lands. Exactly what does that mean? Does that mean they got them to vacate and they took the lands, or does that mean they actually defeated the people?
I mean, I think it's usually military defeat, and then they install their, political um, jurisdiction in there. But the sort of this idea of Greater Germany, like Rome never really took them over. I'm sure there was a little bit
Right.
of incursion in the more southern parts, right? But as they push into the kind of the heartland or the motherland, um, they don't get there. They never actually take that over. So there's this historical sort of hangover idea that we've inherited of barbarians, and that is a Latin name and term used by the Roman armies to refer to the Germans, whom were we understand what a barbarian is. They're big, they're tough and fearsome. They fight well. It's hard to take them over. And Rome liked to brag that they were able to beat the barbarians, and of course, there were certain battles and things where they did. But as far as taking them over, they never did. And so it's both kind of an insult to call someone a barbarian, but it's also a bit of a compliment, um, where it's like, yeah, you're a Neanderthal, you're a brute, but we respect your strength. You're a tough guy, and you're fierce in battle. Um, so that's anyway. So right at the moment that the Roman Republic is moving into the Roman Empire under the leadership of Julius Caesar, we could say that what's going on in Europe, there's a loss of liberty and freedom, and it's moving into a kind of a dark era of oppression. Well, right at that moment, in comes this new group of people that is, in my mind, we can't prove it exactly, but the idea that Hagoth shows up with 5,000 Nephites and their wives and children, and forms the basis of a new group of people that would embody the some of the better parts of Nephite culture, politics, religion, language, military ability and power. That injection into Europe makes a lot of sense in terms of preserving. I mean, there's got to be balance and pushback, right? If like
Right.
empires and tyranny cannot dominate forever, and I don't know if that's simply natural or kind of God's policy, but He doesn't let things get too bad, um, because it sort of defeats the purpose of coming here and living a life, right?
Well, not only that, he clearly had a greater work at play if we're going to look at over the next 1,000 years, because at the same time, from Judea, from Europe in general, we had the spreading of the gospel, and we have the beginnings of the great apostasy taking place. So we have other factors to consider in terms of God's plan for the world, right? So instead of a simple, well, we're not just going to let this one particular bad guy at any time in history rule too long, which just seems to be this cyclical case. There is a very specific movement that God's making happen, right? And when we plug in this potential Nephite idea where they come into that story, that European narrative during that same time, is what's so interesting, right? Uh, one
Yeah.
thing one thing that one thing I'll note. So what we have here is we have these peoples now. We have this Anglo-Saxon kind of background that you covered well, and so now we'll start moving into diving just a little bit more into some of the cultural markers that you just barely mentioned, because there are some cultural markers that start to add layers of depth in terms of the significance of who these
Yeah.
people are, right?
Yeah. And before we do that, let me finish this point. I just brought up this map.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a pretty straightforward modern map of, Germanic nations and peoples. And you can see very clearly that's England. Up here, that is not England. That's Scotland. That's Wales.
I'll make sure to put your mouse on instead
I
of on the StreamYard tab. Go to the actual tab where the image is so we can see your mouse.
Good point. Good point.
There
This
we
is
go. I see
England
it
right
now.
here. And I'm actually not even familiar with this little tail. That I'm wondering if that's Welsh land as well, because I've never heard it referred to as something
Yeah, because
specific.
that's Wales right above it, right?
That's Wales right there. That's Scotland. That's Ireland, and they're very different things, right? And so I didn't know those distinctions very well as a younger person, but you can see here these are the distinctly German dominated, either by language or blood, um, nations of today. And there is, if different maps showing the historical movement. There's German blood all over Europe, even down into Africa. It's all through Italy and France and Spain, and so, um, but they're not necessarily dominant. But so these are the areas that have stayed primarily German more than any other thing. And what's important about this is to understand the we have this idea again, as modern Americans, um, we conceive of ourselves as there are two primary names that kind of go along with Western civilization. One is Judeo-Christian, and then this is kind of like a religious concept or grouping. The
Right.
other is Greco-Roman, which kind of speaks to culture.
Right.
And they both identify themselves. Greco-Roman is the culture or influence of Greece and Rome. And there's no debating that Rome has been a huge cultural influence through Europe, all of Europe, um, as well as into the United States since the beginning. And of course, the more ancient roots of Rome is Greece, and so we conceive of ourselves as a Greco-Roman civilization, or if we want to take on a more less culture political, more religious, we would say Judeo-Christian. And I'm referring to the commonality between Jews and Christians and their belief in the same scriptures mostly, and now, the thing that we need to point out here is that pull that map that you had up, Dustin.
Yeah, which one?
Just the other one. Just I want to see the larger.
Yeah, I've got here. Let me pull up this one. This one's pretty much the same. I was going to show it next, which was the Roman Empire by 500 AD, which is interesting because what you'll notice, just as a side note, that the Anglo-Saxons had since come over here. And where did the Romans go? Not there anymore.
Yeah.
Not to mention their empire got split into two. So you have the west half and the east half.
Now, so what we're looking at right now, this is a good map. That is Greco-Roman, and that is Judeo-Christian. But guess what is not Greco-Roman and is not Judeo-Christian? The Germanic, English, Celtic, British peoples aren't Judeo-Christian
All
in
up through
that
here.
sense, and they're not Greco-Roman. And this battle, this between culture, between religion, I like to call them like influence groups because it's hard to nail all the pieces. but one is centered in Rome or Greece, or if you will, it's centered on the Holy Roman religion and the religion of the Jews. But guess what? That is not the religion of the Germans or the English traditionally. Until you get to recent centuries and the right, I don't probably have a great year. I'm going to say it's somewhere around the 1400s. The Holy Roman Empire, or basically the religious empire that is actually an entirely different empire than the Roman Empire.
Right.
Um, the Holy Roman Empire never militarily could achieve what they wanted to do, which was take over everything. Um, but the Holy Roman Empire managed to do it a lot more successfully through religion. They eventually, instead of just trying to take over everything and control it directly, they sent in priests to to leverage influence that way, which was a lot more successful of a program ultimately, and where a lot of it's the avenue through which so much of this Roman influence ended up coming into the modern composite of English, British, and Germanic peoples today. So this is important moving forward because we Americans or Anglo-Saxons conceive of ourselves as Roman or Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian when we just simply aren't. That is not our origin.
Well, we showed the map last week. I mean, you want to pull that up again? I mean, it's not a wasted time to emphasize one more time the map that we showed last week that showed the majority of the origins of people in the United States, of Americans. It obviously doesn't speak to every living soul in the country, but it shows the dominating cultural background or the lineage that they come from, right from Europe. And as we saw, it was Germanic and English blood, or German and English blood. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so the dark is all the Germanic.
Yep, the dark
dominance
is primarily German DNA in those counties, or a
the red's
majority.
English.
The red is English,
out there,
and the green is Irish, which are a Celtic group.
Celtic, yeah.
And then you've got down in Louisiana there, you've got that's French, which is Gaulish or Frankish blood, which has ties to Celtic and Germanic much more than it does to anything else.
Right.
And so we've got on the list here, you've got English, Anglo-Irish, Irish, Irish-German, German, Dutch, Norwegian,
Germanic,
Finnish, Portuguese, Italian, French, Polish. So that's and again, it's very interesting from the Book of Mormon perspective that the Lord gathered to this land the peoples that he wanted to gather. And it goes as far as to say nobody comes to this land save the Lord brings them. So there is design in this. This isn't random. Right. This isn't just what happened. And most interestingly to me is this red English dominance through the Mormon corridor. And that there is a distinction. Obviously, if we trace that back just a little bit, there's in the 1830 church, some people were attracted to it through Joseph, through the Book of Mormon, through the restored gospel. There's some people that they were attracted to it, they joined it. We can see on this map the result of that. That majority ends up following Brigham into Europe, and it's funny because it's actually said that, well, a lot of the people that went with Britain were the European converts that the 12 had converted that didn't actually know Joseph as well as they knew Brigham. And so the Brighamites really are Norse more than they are English. But the modern demographics actually say, no, there's more English than anything,
right,
through the Mormon corridor. And it's very curious then, how shall we from a Book of Mormon point of view, what's the significance of all this here? Like, why these differences? I believe there's a lot here that's significant to our understanding. So
But
anyway,
go ahead.
well, so let me just finish this point. The word Christian is used in the Book of Mormon and is defined as people who follow Christ. The true followers of Christ are Christians. However, in modern Europe and America and in the modern Christian movement that has no origin in the Book of Mormon, well, and that's funny because this video is kind of about how what I just said isn't true. but but a Christian from in the European sense is somebody from the Holy Roman version of Christianity. In other words, the early Catholic fathers were a little bit protective of that term. The Jews who were following Christ early on were, according to Origen, one of the early church fathers, they were not Christians. Christians referred to them and these other fringy Jewish kind of people who had accepted Christ and that was a completely different thing. And that, we understand that the original Church of the Apostles was largely slaughtered or genocided, and
Right.
they were putting to death anybody who was actually following Christ if they could. That was the satanic agenda.
Not much different than what happened in the Americas.
Exactly. And so the term Christian is not referring originally to, at least this is per records I've read from the Catholic point of view. So you could argue this a little bit, but as far as they're concerned, they are the Christians, and the original Christians weren't the Christians. Those were followers of the way, followers of Jesus, converted Jews, whatever, but they weren't Christians. And so the idea of Christianity moving forward from very early on, it's entirely a Holy Roman Empire creature, which is, the Book of Mormon identifies that group as the Great and Abominable Church. And so that's the Christian part of it. What's the Judeo part of it? Well, the Jews are the group that killed Jesus and kicked out all the original followers of Christ, right? So
Right.
the Judaism that moves forward out of Palestine gets mixed up ultimately with the Christianity of the Holy Roman Empire. That's what Judeo-Christian is referring to. Now, the origin of Christian belief or belief in Christ in Britain actually has a completely different tradition. And we see through these maps that it's true also the Germanic people. They're never fully taken over and Latinized and Christianized and so forth. Although, well, the later, Catholic influence did become rather ubiquitous through Europe. But they were never fully conquered. And so what you have is this duality that emerges. It's like that we're Judeo-Christian Greco-Romans, and yet we're not. We're Anglo-Saxon Germanic, and our roots are actually in paganism, which is confusing to people because in their mind, paganism just equals like, half-naked barbarians, sacrificing people in the forest. And the reason we think that is that's how the Romans portrayed the people that they called pagans. But pagans really just refers to villagers or outlying territories that weren't fully conquered, or maybe they were conquered, but they didn't represent the culture and religion of Rome. And so that's all that pagan means. But it's taken on once the Holy Roman Empire rolled in, pagan became associated with, more with a kind of a satanic or at least very brutal, ugly kind of religion, and it's definitely not civilized.
Right. And that goes along with those other two not phrases, but Roman pejoratives, the barbarians,
the pagans,
and the heathens.
We'll get into that.
We'll get into the heathens.
Yeah. So this is like the history is it's really key here to understand there's two major influence groups here: Celtic, English or Anglo, and Germanic, which again, the Celts are a separate people, but the Germans push into Britain, and there's a mixing or melting pot right there between those two groups. And then they become very unified because their common enemy is the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman construct or influence group. And so Rome, for a very long time had an agenda to either take over directly all of these lands and peoples, or to take them over religiously. And the only thing that prevented them from so doing was this plucky Germanic barbarian blood that was like, no, we're not, like, we'll never go along with this. Now, this brings us into some of the cultural markers that were like where you were going with that.
Yeah, and before we jumped into the cultural markers, I actually remembered that there were just a couple of those historical pieces that John and Donald Nelson brought up that I wanted to point out. They were just interesting to consider when we're looking at this. These Anglo-Saxons. Here, I'll pull any of these maps will do. I'll just pull this one back up. Oh, where'd it go? Now I just lost it. This one's good. There it is. Okay, here it is again. Well, this is a slightly different one, but they're basically all the same because they're just showing this general movement over here to the British Isles, right? So we have the Angles, they have the Saxons, we have those Frisians that we talked about over here. Obviously the Lombardies, which were here, and they ended up going more south, as we talked about, which we'll get into again here.
Originally a northern kingdom.
Yeah, originally up here.
Right over Berlin.
Was it on this side or was it on this side?
The north side, yep.
Yeah, so yeah, the Lombardies over here. And anyway, this isn't the same map that we were looking at last week, but it shows the same main tribes up here. So we have these here, and the idea is where do the Anglo-Saxons come from? Because, like you mentioned, even though we have all these other tribes, the Frisians, Lombardies, etc., the dominant group that comes out of this ends up being the Anglo-Saxons, because it's like, well, aren't they separate? It's like, yeah, they're both Germanic tribes. They end up kind of become mixed over here once they migrate. And so the Anglo-Saxons in our day, as we're looking back through history, the first place that they come from is England, right? It's not until we go further and further back we say, oh, actually, before England, they were over there in northern Germany, Denmark area, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we're looking back through history, that's what we see, the Anglo-Saxons as one people, as they get kind of enmeshed over here with the Brits and the Celts, and then they kind of take over this area in terms of their cultural dominance. Well, the piece that's interesting, or pieces that's interesting, is some of the fragments of their history of where did they come from. One of those is that's fun is that kind of lineage map that you have. Do you have that on hand, by the way? Or did you take a picture of it? Or
I did, and then I forgot that I did, but
that's okay. But while you're pulling that up, I'm also going to pull up the Nelson brothers document here, or their book, their little book, and we can also link this in for the video description for people to look at. Nephites in Europe. They put a lot of these pieces in here as well. That we have talked about, and we're talking about other stuff that's not in here, and they talk about stuff that we don't have time to get to. Donald and John Nelson. So we'll include that. But what's interesting is some of these points here we'll just mention. The earliest written history by the Saxons of continental Europe said, what is certain is that the Saxons arrived in these parts by sea. So they came by sea, according to this document. And one of the oldest English accounts that affirms that the leading family of Denmark originally arrived by boat from an unknown land across the ocean. Isn't that interesting? Medieval accounts from both Danes and Saxons affirm that the Saxon and Danish people were originally kindred peoples at times ruled by literal brothers. So it's showing that strong connection in that northern part of Germany and Denmark. Here's another interesting one. Earlier records suggest that the oral accounts have ancient origins. An account written in Rome around 100 AD, which we talked about, says that there was a religious tradition that was already in circulation in that part of Northern Europe where these tribes were, that involved a sacred procession on land of a miniature model seafaring ship in memorial of some event that was unclear to these Roman observers. So they're celebrating some sort of passage by boat, which is interesting, isn't it? 5, the earliest account describing the Lombard origins, the Lombardy tribe, describes their previous homeland also across the ocean. That same account said that the northern portion of their homeland had a name that meant destruction or ruin, and that was something that you had mentioned last week. And of course, we know that Hagoth and their peoples departed in the northern area from the land of desolation. And then finally, one account specifically said that when their boat reached the shores of Europe, their revered leader was a man named Hadgoth. And later in the document, he actually goes through. Let's see, where is it? Right here. No, he goes through tracing the name Hadgoth and where it comes through here. Right, you'll see in this document, tracing his name and some different forms of it. So anyway, you can see some of that stuff here. I just wanted to point those pieces out, which is just some more interesting pieces of evidence of where did these guys come from, and then that lineage map that you kind of have from that book kind of adds to that, or rather corroborates the mystery of the origins of the Anglo-Saxons.
It corroborates is probably better. Here's the map. This is a big fold out that I have, and so it's just a photograph, a JPEG of it. It's too big to scan, but let me see if I can zoom in. Well, before I do that,
real quick, tell us what book this came out of.
Oh, this comes out of a book called. This is the book right here. The Royal House of Britain and Enduring Dynasty by the Reverend W.M.H. Milner. And I think I've seen it like on eBay occasionally. I don't know that it's in print or anything. Inherited this from my wife's grandfather, who got it somewhere.
The idea is that this is all the ancient oral traditions that had been passed down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. So and I was making the statement that English Christianity doesn't have an origin in the Holy Roman religion or faction. And now certainly it was heavily influenced by that later on. And how that kind of looked was, if we kind of go back to the period of Henry VIII, at that point, Rome was pretty much in charge of running the religious scene in the kingdom in Britain. And of course, the famous conflict came up that Henry could not divorce somebody if he wanted to, and he wanted to, and the Pope's like, no, I won't permit it. And so Henry VIII, and again, we view Henry negatively in modern times, and that might be deserved. I've become convinced that it's not fully deserved, and that history is complicated. But what Henry did was, in this sense, was really cool. Because he basically said, look, we've allowed you guys to be in charge, but it's not because you were here first or that you were the original religion. It's that we allowed you to. So they actually, there's a tradition in England and Britain, but particularly England, that their religious origins in Christ-centered worship are older than Rome's, and that they can assert that dominance anytime they want to if they don't like what Rome is doing. And this is what happened in the case of Henry VIII. It's happened throughout the ages. I think the most recent time it was used, again, it was in the 1920s, I want to say. I don't remember the dispute, but the Royal House of England was like, we don't have to do what you say because we are older than you are. And so, and this is part of that. Oh yeah, so the Church of England was not necessarily started at the time of Henry VIII, but it was a type of reformation or restoration of an older tradition that the English or the Brits could go to in lieu of using Rome's, version of it. And
Right.
so those the knowledge and history of that was being lost in more recent times. And there was a group of Church of England pastors who became very interested in trying to preserve that tradition and not let it vanish, and that Christianity just simply comes from Rome, and that's it, and that they're the origin of everything. So this little book, this little pink book, is some of those writings that are collected up, passing on a lot of these ideas. And so now we're looking at this map. Comes in the book if it's intact, because you'd have to buy a used one. And basically, the bottom is going to show you the more recent and well, yeah, Queen Mary, George VI, Queen Elizabeth II. So these are George V. These are very modern monarchs of
Right.
England.
And I'll just interject. So one of the purposes here is to kind of show the tradition of how the line of David was preserved, with the destruction of Jerusalem with the Babylonian conquest during the time of Jeremiah, how Jeremiah fled with a group of people and they eventually landed in the British Isles, is the idea, and that they've orally traced that. And you can see, I think it's in the center left portion.
So yeah, if you follow the line back, the English line, it follows this route right here, and it goes into. Might have to back out a little bit. The modern throne of England comes through James the Fourth of Scotland became James the First of England. So it was the House of Stuart, which has changed its name to the House of Windsor since then. Same house, but that was actually a Scottish line, which had an earlier origin in Ireland. So the current English crown isn't English, it's Irish, which is funny. But we trace that back. You can see here's the Norman line, here's the Saxon line, the Tudor line, which I think Henry VIII comes through there. These lines are all interrelated if you keep going back, but we get to that line. Basically, they show Judah and then the house of David. This is all Old Testament lineage. And then they show the crossover coming in right here. Joseph of Arimathea and Anna, which is believed to be his daughter, the cousin of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The British tradition is that Joseph was Mary's uncle, which would have made him Jesus' great uncle, which then offers an explanation for Joseph asking the body from Pilate. It would have been his right as the head of the household to say, the family wants to take the body, you have to give it to us. The tradition is that the family of Christ, and that would be, it's called the Bethany 12 group traditionally, but it included Mary Magdalene. It included Mary and Martha, and possibly Lazarus and these people were very close to Christ, but it's conceived of that they were actually family, and that they were brought by Joseph out of Palestine and into England for protection. Joseph himself actually being an English citizen. Well, at the time it would have been Britain and not England, but Joseph himself being a British citizen and owning the tin mine, many of the tin mines of southern England or Britain at the time. And Joseph was also a Roman senator and citizen, presumably because of his wealth and his holdings in Britain, but was Jewish. And anyway, interesting guy. But he brings people over, and from there we actually have a mixing of what might be the line of Christ into Britain and later England, and might or might not have something to do with today's royal family, which admittedly today's royal family is more than corrupt and probably satanic. But that's not unprecedented. That actually happens in the line of Judah,
Right.
though some of those kings become satanic.
Yeah. Well, let me pause right here and interject real quick so we don't get too far
Yeah.
off track. So the idea is we have these oral traditions, and we'll actually have more time in probably one of our later episodes where we'll probably come back to this even more, because the overall idea that we want to spend time on later is focusing on tracing Israel, right? Tracing the lines of Israel. Where did they go? Where are they? Who are they? Who are we? Is the big question. And we talked about that previously. And that is the overarching question as we're diving into this Nephites in Europe. It's a fun, chase of historical information, but there is some significance which we will
Yeah.
spend time on further down the road. On this particular map, while the line of David is interesting, they bring in the Saxon line,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
But of note here with what we were talking about is that there's an unknown origin. You trace that Saxon line and it just appears out of thin air.
Yeah, it's the Norse line right there. You can see it, right? It's
Yeah.
like these all have a much more like the ancient British. Um, it just kind of actually shows this origin in Israel or Judah, all these lines coming out of that, right? And so basically between these two, well, I want to say that's one, it's unified, it's Judah. And then there's a split between Judah's two sons, and then it all cascades down from that, except the Norse line. That just comes out, well, there's this one link right here, but yeah, it visually kind of pops out as an outlier. And so, yeah, where do we go with that? We what what we're missing here, and what at least what I'm trying to establish is that ancient European history is basically lost and covered up by a Roman propaganda that all things center on Rome, and all culture is Rome, and all religion is Rome, and it all came from that area around the Mediterranean or the Roman Empire. And you either again refer to it as the Romans and the Greeks, the Greco-Roman, or as the Roman Christian and the Sanhedrin Jews. And again, the
Right.
more we understand history and the scriptures, that's the enemy. That's the wrong side. That's not the side we want to be on. And interestingly enough, it's not the side that we actually come through, whether culturally or lineally. We really come from a different place, although we have been heavily influenced by the other side over the centuries. And so that missing history is really like, if let's just put on our conspiracy hat for a minute. What would be Satan's tactic of taking over a, a group of people, or a remnant of the house of Israel? What's he going to do in order to take them over? If he can't take them over militarily, He'll try to take them over any other way that he can. He'll try to remove their history. He'll try to confuse them as to their true roots or lineage, their true history, their true religion and whatnot. He will confuse it, and if not entirely burn it down and replace it with a fake. And so the the Anglo-Saxons in particular, um, among the Germanic tribes, have this interesting character within all of this, where they're distinctly Germanic, which does appear to come through the Haygoth line. And um, then, amongst all the German tribes, they, more than any other tribe, lost I mean, they didn't just lose their history, they lost everything. So you can say the modern English, more than um, any other Germanic tribe, and perhaps more than most other groups of comparable size or influence, have lost everything to do with their history. They just don't know who they are at all, except to say or European. Not and
Right.
again, in most modern times, not even Germanic. We like
Right.
English people in America, or well, I can't speak for people in England. I haven't been there, but um, they're just like, well, we're English, we're European. That's about as deep as it gets for most people. And then and if you're in America, that's obfuscated one more time by Americanism. Well, we're Americans, and we were at one time English, and so talk about an interesting group of people that have very compelling origins as far as we can dig in and see from all these things. And yet they know nothing about who they really are, even just in terms of going a little bit further back into European history.
Right.
And
Um,
the cultural enemy is definitely the one that created that obfuscation.
okay, great. Well, let's skip ahead now into some of the cultural markers. Let's start with the most fun of them, um, for obvious reasons. I'll pull it up, and once I pull it up, here we go. Oh, wait, come on. There we go. Open a new tab. That's what I wanted. So the Anglo-Saxons come and start dominating culturally what is now known as England, because it becomes known as England, which shows that they dominated it. So what are we looking at here?
So we're looking at English longbowmen.
Yeah, so if anyone played Age of Empires at any point in time, whether 20 years ago or more recently, you'll know the longbow, right? Because that was one of the strengths of being the English, is having this part of your military aspect, the longbows, or if you watch, Braveheart, or any number of movies that show it, people are familiar with the longbows of the English. So what's interesting is that the longbows of the English, now bow and arrows, those have been around since anciently, right? So just to talk about a bow and arrow in general doesn't have any particular significance. So what I would like you to talk about, Josh, is the significance of the longbow and how that might tie into this Nephite culture.
Right. So yeah, the longbow. I mean, yeah, many cultures have utilized bow and arrow, and I want to say they have an origin in the Middle East, actually, but um, that's a different study. Um, but the question isn't whether or not a group of people possess a bow and arrow historically, but to what degree that is a significant part of their identity. And the English longbow was distinctly an English thing, amongst enemies who were fighting against the English, who didn't have that kind of weapon in their arsenal. Now they may have had bows, but the longbow was a different sort of thing. Um, it was bigger, and they could shoot them further. English longbowmen had to. It was basically it took a long time to build the strength to wield a longbow. To pull the sucker back, it took training and basically muscle building to the extent that they trained from early years, um, to have the kind of strength to do it. The English longbowmen, their skeletons have a larger, stronger right hand to pull the bow back. And so basically, in archaeology, they can identify English longbowmen when they pull them up because of
From their
this
skeletal structure, you mean?
skeletal, yeah, evidence. They're like, oh, this is an English dude. So it's that distinct. So it had become, and the English longbow was often the key to victory in a battle for the English. The use of the longbow was saving the day often throughout the centuries. So the English are known for it. The bow is a big thing in English identity. It was like today we might use I don't know, the F-16 or the Apache helicopter as a sign of our military might. In these times, it was the longbow. That was like that thing was rocking. Well, okay, so where does this come from? Well, if we go back further into the heart of the German tribes and earlier eras, the Elven or Elben people, which is somewhat synonymous with the Langobards and the Goths and so forth, and right where the Anglo-Saxons come from, are also known for their use of the bow in particular. It was a favored weapon. They relied on it a lot, and that's basically the origin of the English longbow. And again, when you link that with these people, these are smaller, rural, less populous people, often than their enemies, which are coming out of like the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire. Their ability to fight back as powerful warriors with things like the longbow, it's an important symbol of resistance to tyranny, and it's associated with liberty. So what's interesting then with the Nephite connection is the importance in the Book of Mormon, in the origin story of the Lehite civilization, is the story of Nephi and his bow. This is a key story that would have passed down, through the centuries and through the generations. Our common forefather Nephi, he made his own bow and saved the whole family through that act. And bows were important to the founding of their society, and it was also religiously and spiritually important because the Nephi making his own bow was the way that he helped his father to repent of his murmuring. And so there's a spiritual salvation implicated in that, as well as temporal salvation, in that Nephi was able to obtain meat, and he was able to feed everybody. He was able to soothe Laman and Lemuel's their rage and disgruntlement through that act. And so certainly and that story has come down through First Nephi to us in recent times through the Book of Mormon. And it's, everybody in Mormon generations are like, oh yeah, totally, Nephi and his bow. We know it. Certainly the Nephites had a similar thing going on. And then we just happen to see that the Elven people, the forefathers of the Anglo-Saxons, the bow was a big deal, and the bow was a big deal to the Anglo-Saxons. Militarily, liberty, freedom, independence, got to have a longbow.
Okay, so let me just pull up one more. Now, we already looked at the Elbe River, obviously. Let's just look at it again. This is a closer look at the Elbe, known as the Elbe Basin. So it starts right here, right, but right this base of Denmark,
Yep.
and that's how you can identify in those other maps we were talking about. So yeah, we had that correctly. So it comes right through here. You see right there, Elb, and
Yep.
so this Elb idea is, like you mentioned, it is the origin of the word elf. Elven people are the Elben people,
Yeah.
and the Elben peoples would have been the Angles and the Saxons and the Lombardies.
Uh-huh.
Those were the Elben people,
Yeah.
and that will
Just in terms of geography, it's the same place.
right. It's
I
the
mean,
same place. The Elben
there
people are
are
the people that lived along here.
there are regional distinctions between, different areas, and so yeah, you get different place names and family names, but it's the same people. Yeah, for
Right,
sure.
and then there's Dresden right along the Elbe, and then it splits here a little bit, and
Yeah.
then yeah, down here at the bottom this is where it starts to split around, but this is where it
Even
ends.
even in today's modern Germany, the Elbe is probably the most important. It's still a factor in like modern demographics and politics. The reality that that river is right there and how the people are arranged around it. So it's a center point, and the river introduces a pattern in that which has implications in a number of things.
Yeah, and we will have to spend a dedicated episode on more of the pieces regarding the word Elb or Alb, and the meanings of behind that, as well as a lot of the not necessarily hidden meanings in the lore of the Lord of the Rings, because they're not really even hidden. They're actually kind of on the surface. Um, that that Tolkien was kind of pulling out of all this lore that you're talking about and put it into his stories behind the peoples. Elven is obviously one of them, one of the most prominent, and it comes from this word right here. One, I will say this one note about it, just because we already mentioned it today. I will point out that part of the lore that Tolkien included for the elven people is that they came from across the sea to the west.
Yeah.
so so just according to the lore that Tolkien did, the Elben people or the Anglo-Saxons did originate from across the ocean to the west, which is exactly where we are saying these Hagothites, these Nephites that were with Hagoth. Anyway, we will approach more of that in a later episode. But I just wanted to mention now, since I already mentioned that alleged history of the Anglo-Saxons and where they are alleged to have come from, that also matches the lore that Tolkien included for the Elven people, which are the Elben people, which are the
Now,
Anglo-Saxons.
and this is a great point to inject, that it's not just Tolkien that establishes that. The idea of elven people is embedded into English tradition,
Right.
and most distinctly through names that hail to that era. So
Right,
the
which
name
we will which
Alfred.
we will include in that further episode. I want to do a deep dive on all those names and stuff.
Okay, yeah. Well, this isn't a deep dive, but like the name Alfred is a very English name, right? It means
Right.
elf lord. And
Right.
there are many names, English names, that denote the idea of an elf in the name. Like Queen of the Aubrey is Queen of the Elves,
Alvin.
and Alvin means friend of the elves or friend counselor, which I believe it actually really just means elf. But that the idea of an elf in ancient English thinking is that elves are good and noble and friendly and helpful.
Right.
And so, kind of the modern definition is like, oh, Alvin, it means like an elf friend. But
Right.
if you
Well,
take a
Alvin,
look at,
linguistically, Alvin would just mean Elvin.
yeah, exactly. So to just call your child Elvin was to appeal to this noble uh, heritage or lineage of what you view as like a you know your forefathers who were good people. If not, it might even be pointing to kind of a golden age feeling, like that's when we were at our best, is when we were the elves. And so
So hey, let's address this. So John's bringing up a point here. Nephi's bow was used for food for survival. The English longbow was a war weapon. The Nephites gave emphasis on Laban's sword for war purposes. That's a really good comment, John.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, like I say, is that proof? It's not. But we know that among weapons, so there are two weapons potentially in the Nephite lineup that hold greater cultural significance. It would be the sword of Laban or the bow of Nephi. And so we
Here,
know that
let me. Can I interject to answer a little bit?
totally.
So so what? So John, I saw the same thing, and I remember saying that to Josh when he was originally pointing it out. But just a couple of things to consider. First of all, we don't disagree with the point that you're making, at least on the surface, right? That for sure the Book of Mormon itself Mormon identifies to us, the reader, that the sword of Laban was the object mentioned when it comes to war, several times, maybe two or three times, as an object, and so that is significant. But let's maybe look back through history from here, going backwards, and we look and we see that the English of all people developed the longbow, the English, and no one else does except for the Elven people. The Elven people also have a longbow, and and we are already showing that they have a very likely origin from the Western Sea, from the Nephite people. We're piling it on, and we're going to add some more to it. So it starts to have a pretty easy connection in our view that okay, the Nephite people likely would have had some significant connection to the bow, and we also know that they were very strong people. They were considered very strong, and there's a reason why the Romans called them the barbarians. They couldn't conquer them, militarily speaking. And it would take someone of great strength to handle something like a longbow. It's very possible that to the Nephites, the longbow was just their bow and arrow. That Nephi kind of started this tradition that he made a bow. He made a bow. Again, I'm speculating, but it's not outside of reason that someone large in stature would make a bow that's large in stature. Why would Nephi make a puny little bow? He wouldn't. That would be stupid. He would make a bow and arrow for him, for his size. Now, that could easily create this tradition of a larger bow among the Nephites because Nephi started this tradition of making these bows. Now, again, it doesn't take away from your comment of the military emphasis in the Book of Mormon being on the sword of Laban, but it does beg the question: when these peoples show up to Europe, do they have a larger bow and arrow tradition than your Europeans that are around them? So anywho, that's just something to consider.
Yeah.
And by the way, they don't need to mention it. Of course, they have them, and actually, the bow and arrow is not emphasized in the same way that the sword of Laban is. But the other point remains is that it's very possible that to the Nephites, they didn't hold up the bow as a sign in their own civilization as a sign of warfare. But if they show up to Europe and they're a larger people, and they show up to Europe and their bows are significantly mightier than those around them, anybody would prefer to get rid of enemies at a distance than up close. Anybody would prefer that. I mean, we don't even need. Where's your source on that? Please, like, let's not insult each other's intelligence. Anyone would prefer that. So if this people came across and had this bow and arrow that all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, these guys are wimpy or they're smaller and we're way stronger. We have way bigger bows than them. And they just, apparently they haven't discovered that if you make it bigger, it goes farther. And then they just take advantage of that. It almost happens naturally. It's not because they were trying to put emphasis on the bow. And again, that's speculative, but it's also within reason. It's very logical thinking. So
Yep.
it's not outside of the realm of possibility that all people that are larger in stature developed a bow that was larger in stature, so that by the time they show up to Europe, they're on a scene where people have these crappy bows and arrows, and they're like, oh my gosh, we can waste these people from 100 yards, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like I say, where did that bow? It's noted among the English and it's noted among the elves, and it appears to have an origin from over the sea. Otherwise, all the peoples of Europe would have been using these things and would have had the tradition of it because they were superior in that sense. So you're correct that the Book of Mormon doesn't dwell very much on bows. We know that they had bows and arrows in their warfare, but there's this particular emphasis that, I mean, again, the bow did play an important role in the founding of the society
in their survival. Yeah.
through that story. It's just like one of those things that every kid would have known. Well, Nephi made a bow, and the bow that Nephi made was, um, they brought something that was out of the Middle East that was crafted through a certain tradition. Those broke. Nephi goes out and finds some wood and figures out how to make one. And so that, like I say, we can't prove that that went on to become a new tradition. But when you see that what a big deal the bow has become in a group of people that seem to come out of that, it makes a nice line between the two. So I call it the sign of the bow. It is a thing in the Book of Mormon, and it's a thing in these later German and English peoples that is pretty distinct. So it's probably enough on that.
Yeah. Well, and so that is one worth considering. Again, at the end of the day, these are piles of evidence, and if you want to toss away one, that's fine. But at the end of the day, the collection of trees makes a forest, and if you remove a single tree, the forest remains. So the next big thing to consider, well, a couple big things to consider, and Josh already mentioned this last week a little bit, but we'll put a little more emphasis on it today. We have, among these Anglo-Saxons, we have a culture of freedom, and we have a culture of wanting to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And we see that in, as we mentioned, the founders of the pilgrims that came over to Plymouth Rock, that came from that region. They didn't come from England. They came from that Netherlands region, which was that Anglo-Saxon region. They come from there. So that people seem to have that. Then we have the English and the tradition of freedom that they bring. Obviously, we have the monarchy as well, but it's the Anglo-Saxons that come, the English that come to America that also want that freedom. That's still the Anglo-Saxon people that end up becoming the founding fathers, that end up forming this nation that is the symbol of freedom. That's not a small thing. That's a huge thing. And that was, at the time of Hagoth, he's with Moroni. That is the prominent idea among the Nephite peoples through all of their righteous stretches, which is freedom. Mm-hmm. Correct?
Yeah. And so that's a pretty, I mean, I will readily say it's a much stronger pattern from the Book of Mormon to this proposed theory of Hagoth in Europe. You have to read the Book of Mormon as an American, like in this regard, you read about Captain Moroni, you read about liberty and fighting tyranny, and that's not new. Like when any American reading that's not new to an American. Like those ideas, that spirit is alive and well in today's America.
So how about this? So Sue says every people wanted to be free. Therefore, just because these people wanted to be free doesn't make them Nephites. We're not saying it's because they wanted to be free. We're saying that the Anglo-Saxons, above all the people of the earth, showed the most mighty ability to create freedom, to perpetuate freedom. And we see that through the Pilgrims. We see that through the Founding Fathers. Show me another people that had that ability. But it doesn't even come close.
Yeah, you see it. So where's that? That Elbe River, cutting in right at the base of Denmark and then down in. You have the German heartland is just north of that, Berlin, and then up into Denmark. The Angles, the Saxons, and actually the Jutes also migrated. They never get mentioned, but they're above the Angles, and they all migrate over to England later. But that group was never conquered. That was the group that held the line and said, no, we're not going to be taken over by Rome. That um, and so the proposed landing site for Hagal's ship is just to the west of there, which is the land of Frisia, which literally means the land of freedom or the free land. And the people to this day, that area is known as Frisia. There's actually a modern German dialect currently existed and on the books. It's called Frisian. It's the free language. So this is like a super powerful clue that whoever landed there and originated the German tribes, that they arrive, they get off the boat, and they declare the place a free land. That's like the most important thing. We're going to be free. And again, that idea is very easy for an American to mentally work with, because we've lived that paradigm so much in our own recent history.
Well, and what we're trying to say when we're doing cultural markers, we're trying to say, listen, if this group of Nephites went somewhere, and we know they went somewhere, okay, so if they went somewhere to Northern Europe, we should be able to find traces of their culture. And the time that they came out of the Nephite civilization was a super heavy emphasis on freedom of religion, freedom politically. It was such a huge emphasis because there was a mighty 12-year war on this thing, and these people were trying to free themselves of that. Right? There's just all sorts of stuff going on in that vein that not only made their whole civilization almost crumble, but made them who they were as Nephites, right? That's who they were as Nephites. So we should see that if they go somewhere, because that's a huge group of 5,000 plus people. That is a huge group to go somewhere and implant somewhere, because then over the course of 50, 100 years, 200 years, they're going to become massive.
If you took a bunch of Americans today and dropped them in the middle of China, what do you think their emphasis would be? And what would they name their cities and children? It would be along those themes of like, we're free people. We will, if we can't live free, we'll die free. They're not modern. Well, I want to say that, I guess it would go on an individual to individual basis, but you take a average or random sampling of Americans and throw them into a tyranny, and freedom is going to be non-negotiable. They're going to fight tooth and nail. And that it isn't just there, like, oh, there's a place called Frisia. We see that this spirit and tradition becomes the primary hedge against Roman expansion from there on. They never quite can push into that. That moves over to England. And if you follow European history, the German and English peoples were always the thorn in the side of Roman plans or Holy Roman plans. They were always pushing back on what Rome wanted to do politically with their own ideas about what was right. And so another major moment, and there's a bunch, but I probably can't cover it right now, but the Magna Carta originates right out of England with this crazy idea that, a king can be in charge, but he's not God, and he can't just do whatever he wants. We will limit him with a document. We will write down what the law is, and will be ruled by law, and the king has to conform to that. That, in terms of all the nations of the earth and world history, that doesn't happen very often, that a group of people can push back on tyrannical government to that degree and establish rule of law through a document.
Right. And that's huge, because again, if this people had any particular cultural markers that stood out above other markers, right? Because you could say, well, anybody wants to be free. Actually, that's not really true, especially to the point of willing to sacrifice their lives for it. That is super not true. But a people that's willing to have this be one of their main cultural markers, because England and the English, and eventually Americans who are English, um, they're the ones that push forward this idea of democracy, that push forward this idea of the rule of law is actually above a king. Just like God says that he is going to live by eternal law. Um, so these kings have to live by law. Everyone has to live by law. No one's going to be above the law in that sense. We're all going to live by law, and and that is an incredible marker that should be something of God's people. And someone might come in and say, "Oh yeah, well that would be any one of God's people." It's like, well, for sure, but the Nephites are a special branch of God's people, because even the allegory of the olive tree tells us that all these branches of God's people, they just dwindle. They just go corrupt. They just go terrible, except for one, at least for a long time, until that eventually starts to fade in terms of the allegory. But there's one particular branch of Israel that is above all others in terms of that allegory, and that is this branch of Joseph that's the Lehite nation. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. And the well, like I say, the what Captain Moroni does with the title of liberty, or earlier what King Mosiah does with the laws of Mosiah, um, it's well, it's rare in terms of world history,
Right.
and
Extremely rare.
we would assume, their ability to do that was only because they had God, they had His Word, they had His Spirit. They were able to but the what's the result of having a knowledge of God, having His Spirit, and whatever? Well, it's going to result in something like a constitutional republic. And um, so to see, and again, what I make this, I think it's one of the strongest evidences in my mind, is just what it feels like to be an American today and really understand the spirit of liberty and freedom and fighting for it and all that. You read about it in the Book of Mormon. It's the same one. It's the same spirit. It sounds like an American story, which is a great key point, that's a good indicator that our modern tradition of liberty and freedom it comes from somewhere. It was preserved through the ages. Um, and that but if you just like, well, man, that's the laws of Mosiah and Captain Moroni, like that's the same thing as what Americans are today.
Right.
Well, then how do they connect? How did they how did the one, is it just complete randomness that the German English tradition and spirit is so similar? Well, I mean, like I said, it could be, but I advance it as a good indicator that for all the other things that are showing that this is a likely how um, well that Book of Mormon peoples likely moved to Europe, which is consistent with certain statements made in the Book of Mormon about Lehi's blood and posterity, and that what is distinctly Nephite is preserved through this. And it's been a long time since then, right? Like this line has gone through a beating for many centuries ever since, um, and at every century we kind of tune in to this line. There's some kind of existential threat going on, whether it's the Roman Empire or whether it's the later Holy Roman / Catholic threat, um, or it's the Puritan movement, and the persecution of the Puritans, and then getting into the Americas and the dominance of European and English throne versus the American colonists who wanted to live free and were willing to fight for it, even to the point of civil war. Just because we're all English doesn't mean we're going to put up with tyranny. So if that's coming from within our own society, we're going to put it down there. And so it's not trivial that the American spirit, as we might call it, for liberty and freedom, just happens to be here. And yeah, for me, it has to come from somewhere. And the Book of Mormon presents a clear parallel to that spirit. And so it makes a strong case that there's continuity between the two. I think that's how I wanted to say that.
Yeah, well, and I think that's well said. So that's a great place to wrap it up for today. We'll continue next week, and let's see. I guess we can throw the Zoom chat in there for those that want to continue
Oh,
discussion on this topic or others.
yeah. John just made a really great point. We have to bring this in.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. The German printing press led to greater exposure to the Bible. This eventually led to the religious freedom movements. Yes, and Martin Luther was German. And
Right.
so the Reformation against Roman Catholicism led by a German. And was well, where was that revolution? It was in Northern Europe, Western Europe, and Britain. That's primarily where the Reformation took place. It wasn't so much in the other lands.
An Anglo-Saxon movement.
Yeah. And then, Tyndale, there it is
Right.
again. So
William Tyndale. Yep, there it is again. All right, great. So yeah, we'll continue this next week. There's some more to cover, some more points that we want to hit, so that we can show our case that we think that it does come full circle, that it's essentially the Nephites that go to Europe and the Nephites that come back to America and are part of the peoples that founded this country and are part of the peoples that founded the Restoration and brought the Book of Mormon back. And so that is the overarching argument that we will continue. And let's see. Do you have that link to put in the chat?
I will have it shortly.
I might be able to get it too. Let's see here. Oh, let me see the YouTube one.
Yeah, I didn't. We were in a hurry today.
Oh, right. Yes, we were in a hurry. That's correct.
Almost got it. Okay, yeah, I'm dropping that in right now.
Awesome. We throw that in Telegram too.
Will do.
All right. See you guys next time.